I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Richard Carter, a computer scientist and strategic advisor to government and industry on emerging technologies and strategic change. For over 25 years, Rich has applied cutting-edge technologies to solve hard organizational problems. He's worked both as a leader and strategic advisor for startups and multinationals, mainly in the IT, telecom, and defense sectors. He's produced BAFTA-nominated video games and has been featured in The Guardian, The Times, New Scientist, and the BBC. He currently holds an honorary research position at the University of Bristol. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a fellow of the British Computer Society, and a chartered IT professional. He has a PhD in complexity science, a master's in business administration, a master's in nanotech, and a bachelor's degree in computer science with postgraduate certification in law. So, Richard, welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to start out by asking about your new book, Cognitive Advantage: How Artificial Intelligence is Changing the Rules for Winning in Business and Government. Can you give me kind of a high-level overview of what the book is about and what inspired you to write it?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Tim. That's a great introduction. So the book Cognitive Advantage is really about, I explore how we should be thinking about how AI helps people be able to make better decisions, to make more sense of an increasingly complex world. So we so often hear this narrative, which is a scary one, which is about machines are going to take over the world and we're all going to lose our jobs and so on and so forth. And I just think that's incredibly polarizing and frankly unhelpful and probably inaccurate. So my reasons for writing the book were really just to put a bit of a counter narrative out there, which was saying, look, we don't have to accept the visions of AI that Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk may have promoted a decade or so ago. What if we just sort of think about it more as how can AI help us, then we can start to actually do something meaningful with the technology, and want to inspire people who wouldn't ordinarily think of AI and think about engaging in technology, for them to actually want to do that. So rather than waiting as sort of these sort of passive victims, what I was interested in exploring was basically saying, well, let's just make AI work for us. And so that's the main premise for the book. And what I then want to do is then talk about how might we do that? How might we use AI to actually improve the cognitive performance of us as people, as humans?
Ah, well, so yeah, again, going back to the core premise of this book, AI facilitates better decision making, right? Which is no
Right,
surprise. And it gives organizations that use it a competitive advantage as well, right?
right, 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 exactly. And one of the interesting things here as well, Tim, is that before I started writing the book, I sort of did a bit of a thought experiment where I thought, and this is primarily off the back of GPT-2 when that was released several years ago. And what you had was this powerful AI that was available for pretty much anyone to have a play around with. It wasn't closed off. People could actually get a sense of the power of large language models. And that just got me thinking, was that in a world where everyone's got access to advanced AI, how do you compete? In the limit where everyone has maxed out their use of AI, how on earth do you compete if you've effectively got almost a bit of a level playing field? And so the other side to cognitive advantage was more of a strategy for how you can still compete in an AI-rich world. And what I talk about in the book as well is this idea that to outcompete and to still maintain a competitive advantage, you need to outthink and outmaneuver the competition, because it's not just about the quality and the precision of your decision making and how smart your decision is. It's also your agency to act. It's your ability to actually follow through on that decision, to actually have the effect in the real world that you believe that you need to have, to give you that advantage. So cognitive advantage as a definition was actually being able to comprehend and act in your environment at a pace and with an ingenuity that you actually compromise your adversary's ability to act and comprehend themselves. So the military refer to this as getting inside your adversary's decision loop. So you are effectively shaping their perception of some world or some system or something they're interested in making a decision around. You're effectively shaping their comprehension of that environment, effectively influencing very strongly the decisions that they subsequently make. So that gives you a position of advantage, and hence cognitive advantage was about actually getting in their decision loop in the first place.
Well, and I definitely want to come back to that actually, because those were some of the questions that I had later on. But
Right.
let me go back to trend spotting. AI can spot trends that humans can't. It can make predictions much more rapidly than humans can. So what are some of the best examples of future applications for this that we can expect to see?
Oh, well, I think in general terms, when we talk about AI in this way, in terms of phenomenal pattern recognition, using volumes of data that are just simply incomprehensible to a human or even a team of humans, what we're really talking about is the ability for AI to discover new knowledge. And there are two ways, there's two, if you like, there are two types of knowledge that AI can do arguably better than people can. One is that where we have our, and I'm going to sound a little bit like Donald Rumsfeld now, but we have known unknowns. We know that we don't know something, but at least we know how to articulate the questions that we'd like to have answered about those known unknowns. And AI is really, really good at actually working its way through vast amounts of data. That's not dismissing how hard it is to get data into the right quality in the first place before you can then start to do any kind of training on it. But we'll just leave that conveniently to the side for the moment. But the ability to actually scour large volumes of data and be able to, in the case of, let's say, a cybersecurity company, looking through the network logs of a global network system of a big corporate, for example, and being able to potentially spot anomalies in millions and millions of lines of records in network logs, for example. So that's clearly that has clear application and value in the short term, and there's plenty of companies around the world that are doing exactly that, trying to use AI, not necessarily just in logs. It could actually also be in real time, looking at activity on networks. But the point there is that AI is really quite good at really discovering new knowledge, or discovering knowledge where the search space is combinatorially expansive. It's exponential. So that's where it adds real value, is giving you that sense of coverage of there's no point having data and collecting lots and lots of data if you can't actually analyze it. It's worthless. You have to extract information from data for it to be useful. And that's what machine learning and AI does pretty well. So that's the known unknowns. And then you've got this really powerful element of AI that scares a lot of people, but also fascinates people as well, which effectively AI, because it doesn't necessarily, because the way the algorithm works, they're driven by potentially different cues in the data that may not necessarily be obvious to humans, even human experts. And what that means is, and combine that with, so it may spot patterns that humans would never have ever spotted. Combine that with its ability to exhaustively search a vast search space. And what we start to get into there is where AI starts to discover unknown unknowns. Those kind of like those black swan things where you can never imagine it would happen, or that it could never exist, but it does. We just don't know because we've never seen it. And this is what Eric Schmidt talks about in his book with Henry Kissinger, is this almost this sort of this my goodness, this is a little bit scary, because if AI is starting to discover knowledge and has knowledge that we may never actually have ever reached as humans, then that gives the AI a very interesting and unprecedented advantage over the ability for humans to ever get to that level of knowledge. So the way I talk about that is that unknown unknowns are unreachable to humans. It's not unreachable to AI. And so I think the closest I can come to as a really interesting example of that is actually going back to DeepMind's AlphaGo, where in the second game of that very famous competition with the with the world champion Go player, it made that move I think it was the second game, where everyone just said, "Oh, that's just a novice move. You know, why would you do that? Clearly, this AI is stupid." But it turned out to be a strategy that had never been seen before in the history of Go, at least recorded history of Go, that turned out to be a completely new piece of knowledge about how to win that game. And now, because you could argue that that particular tactic, that particular strategy that AlphaGo discovered may never have been discovered by humans, because whatever pattern recognition was going on may have actually been completely unreachable for humans, and the way that we do pattern recognition. So
Okay.
that's how I see. I tend to sort of take this abstract view of it's a matter of thinking about knowledge and the different forms of knowledge and humans' access to it and humans' ability to perform at those tasks. That's where we need AI to come in and actually do that on our behalf.
Well, so today, most large organizations already process data to find trends, right? So a good common example that most people are familiar with is Google Analytics. People can use that to view their web traffic, right? And that's looking at a massive data set, and it's pulling out really basic information just to see how many people have been there. Similar strategies are used for stock market predictions. I'm not as familiar with that, but what I understand is that there is a lot of software out there and a ton of data crunching that goes on. So what would give AI an advantage over these existing solutions that I just mentioned?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two elements to that. There's two ways in which AI. So if we think, interestingly, I whether it's Google search or whether it's some sort of financial analysis tool or whatever it might be, I'd be surprised if they weren't using a form of machine learning anyway. So I suspect, I mean, this is one of the problems we have with AI, is that it's a very loosely defined term, and actually when we're supposed to talk about AI, we're really talking about machine learning. So I think those two examples are prominent. I think they're likely to have machine learning as part of them. But nevertheless, I think the advantage that AI has, let's say, over more conventional techniques of analysis of data, is the ability to learn from experience. So we don't have to figure out up front what the right answer is to find the right data that we're interested in a massive data set. The algorithms are such, the learning algorithms, they just learn from their own experience of doing that. Sometimes they need humans to help them understand whether they're doing that particularly well. In other cases, they don't. They can basically, they're unsupervised. They just continually go until they've started to spot patterns that they think are potentially of interest. So that ability to effectively take the programmer and take the software engineer or the data scientist out of the loop, and in an autonomous way do that pattern recognition at scale, that's where AI has a significant advantage. But here's the curious thing, is that the greatest threat to something like Google search now, which we heard about recently because Google announced their big red alert when ChatGPT was announced, is that things like ChatGPT, which we know is a very large language model, is now seen as actually a significant existential risk to things like Google search. So the way that Google have engineered their particular solution to basically giving the knowledge of the world giving it to us at our fingertips, ChatGPT is slightly changing the rules by how can you actually add value using AI in a different way to the way that Google search does it. And you could argue that the way ChatGPT is effectively encoding knowledge about what's out there in the world, is a more naturally intuitive way for us to actually engage and explore knowledge with the help of a machine than arguably the way that you would explore knowledge with something like Google search. There's something that's actually just much more, there's something that's much more akin to the way we would talk to a friend with ChatGPT, whereas with Google search, you know all the time that you're actually engaging with a very, very sophisticated knowledge base, but at the end of the day, it's still a very, very sophisticated database at the end of the day. You don't get that same. So there's an interesting way that AI can do things better because it can teach itself, it can learn from experience. But actually, what's really, really interesting is that because it's been able to do that, it's leading to new capabilities that's actually potentially very disruptive to some of these major incumbents, because it's approaching things in a way that is presenting valuable knowledge and the experience of that in a way that actually there seems to potentially be a desire for people to prefer that over what we see at the moment.
Well, so again, we touched on AI's ability to move at a pace and scale where human minds alone can't keep up. Those are your words from the book.
Right.
I'm wondering, one of the reasons I mentioned the financial sector is I'm wondering if the end game for this, and I'm sure that we'll see it in business, will be competition between advanced AI systems, right? So again, going back to our stock market prediction, I did an interview with a gentleman who was involved with derivatives, and he had mentioned using machine learning to do predictions and drive that as well. And basically what he was saying was, look, if we can predict where this is going just a little bit ahead of the competition, then we can get an advantage, and that makes our clients money, right? And so then the challenge becomes, will this become something where it's basically machine versus machine, and humans end up basically out of the loop because they're too slow?
Yeah, I think and high frequency trading as sort of been pioneering this this kind of scenario for a number of years now. And yes, I think the short answer is that we are in for certain types of applications, these highly autonomous intelligent capabilities are inevitably going to be going up against each other, because that's the only way in which you've got any chance of competing. However, whether that will mean that the human is completely taken out of the loop is a slightly different conundrum. And the financial markets are heavily regulated, and they need to be accountable for the decisions they make, not just to their shareholders, but to regulatory bodies as well. So they're seen as not as seen as being good companies and organizations that are governed well. If you have let's just say that let's say we have this highly autonomous AI capability that's making trade decisions, and there are a multitude of other competitors who have their own particular variants of those AI capabilities. There's a real risk of what's called I think it's called a flash shock or something like that. I think that's the phrase they use, which is this idea that it suddenly becomes a race to the bottom, or you get into one of these catastrophic cycles where that is completely unpredictable, where one of the AI starts to undersell a particular stock for whatever reason. It might have termed, well, I'm just going to sell it at that price. And then the others go, oh, well, I'm going to sell it at even lower price. And suddenly the share price of that particular asset has plummeted for no other reason than the AI
Yeah,
got into a trading war with each other.
but it would be the predictive nature making predictions that change the outcome and maybe
Right.
somewhat invalidate the predictions themselves, right? So
Right, that could be right. I mean, if it has the ability to effectively predict the impact of its own actions before it takes those actions, then for sure, yeah, I could see that would be a one, if that's feasible, that would be one way to effectively not fully mitigate, but at least attempt to try and mitigate some of the risk of flash shocks. I might not be referring to them correctly there, but my point really there was that we get to the point, something called accountability, and in the case of those, they might even be called crash shocks, I'm not sure, but whatever it is, if you get into this catastrophic devaluation of a currency because of the some sort of runaway cascade of decisions, automated decisions by AI, you cannot hold an AI accountable. Someone in those organizations who's overseeing the performance of those capabilities is accountable, and they need to be able to explain not only why an AI made a decision about that particular trade and historical decisions on those trades, but also why was it permitted to do that in the first place? What protections were put in place? How do you, the fund manager or whoever it is who's responsible for the custodian of that capability, how can you be assured that you can prevent catastrophic harm, financial harm from actually happening? So if that is the where we go with regulation, and I can't see for one moment that we'll be taking humans out of the loop when it comes to accountability and liability, that then brings us into the fact that a human needs to be able to intervene into that AI capability to stop it doing something catastrophic if, for whatever reason, the humans in the loop start to perceive that they don't like the look of something. And then there becomes a trade-off between potential gain from very, very short, very, very fast trades versus potentially a massive downside if you don't intervene any sooner. So that situational awareness of advanced AI capabilities, I still see that there still needs to be a human or a team who are accountable for the performance of those things. So we still need to be thinking about designing and engineering even highly autonomous capabilities where there's some sort of observance, there's some sort of ability to intervene from humans.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and this was one of the things that I'd wondered about in terms of AI blind spots, right? Because you'd mentioned that AI is able to access knowledge or basically synthesize knowledge from these massive data sets that isn't accessible to the human mind. We're just not able to work with it. And so then one of the questions becomes, I mean, certainly in a forensic sense, but even more so in a real-time sense, right? Are we able to double check some of these decisions that it's making? And it seems like, past a certain point, we're just going to have to accept what it tells us and hope that it's correct and hope that there aren't any blind spots where it's just missing things, right?
We actually looked at this. We looked at trust, how people who are taking high stakes decisions that could have real world impact on people's safety, basically being fed predictions from advanced machine learning models. How do they when under what conditions do they trust the output from a machine learning model enough for them to act on it? And where do they decide that they need more information, they need more assurance, they need more of an explanation of how it arrived at that particular prediction or that particular recommendation? And part of that is to do with understanding how is that particular machine learning model built, what data was used to actually train it, who trained it, who validated it, how is it verified, which is very much in the realm of data scientists, machine learning engineers. That's their job, is to actually to do that, and being really quite clear about the historic performance of that model in terms of accuracy and model performance metrics like precision and recall. So that people start to get a little bit of a sense of the historic performance of that model in terms of false positives and false negatives, and true positives and true negatives. So how many times has it got it right? But that is not the only factor that people take into account when it's useful and it's helpful for them to see that a model, hey, this thing seems to get it right 90% of the time, and it really seems to be able to extract from the data set those really important things that have predictive value. But it's all context dependent. How a human then perceives that is context dependent. And what I mean by that is that if you're already working, if let's say a police officer, let's say they're using a machine learning model that's trying to give them some sense of the likelihood that there could be some criminal activity in a certain part of the neighborhood that evening. Perhaps the AI is looking at Twitter feeds, perhaps it's just looking at historical crime data and what the web is doing, or whatever it might be. It'll be fusing all sorts of different data sources to try and arrive at that kind of prediction. Now, if there's already people in that area, if there's already police in that area, then if the police officer who's back at the station, sitting there with the monitor with the algorithms saying, hey, we predict that you need to put people in that place, that part of the city tonight, and then they look at the map in terms of current deployment, they go, well, we've already got someone only like 3 or 4 blocks away. That becomes a really easy decision. Whereas, because it's context dependent, it's actually really easy. So it's because the cost of getting it wrong is actually quite low because there's already police in that area or close to that area. But if the police are the other side of the city and they're already dealing with an incident, and there's a cost involved in asking them to travel 10 miles to the complete opposite side of the city, on the off chance that the machine learning model's got the prediction right, then the cost associated with listening to the machine learning algorithm and then acting on it changes completely the way whether they perceive whether to trust it or not. So
Yeah.
that we often miss that. We've in the field of data science, machine learning, probably because we're dominated by incredible breakthroughs in terms of capabilities. I think we often miss the fact that humans are less certain. We're less predictable in some ways than the AI that we're intended to try and use. So yeah, so that would be, so in a way, humans are there to actually try and mitigate the risk of the AI having missed something in the first place by questioning it when they need to, and not question it so much if they think that the cost of getting it wrong are actually so low. Don't worry about it. It might be helpful.
Absolutely. It seems like AI may open the door to some predictive ethical dilemmas also. One that came to mind for me was pre-crime in the movie Minority Report, right? And potentially another example of that could be AI, I was going to say starting a war or recommending that you start an war or an invasion because it predicts that an enemy is getting ready to, right? And so, you know,
Right.
it wants to win. It can spot trends. It can spot trends faster and better than a human being. The problem is that what it's responding to hasn't happened yet. Seems like there
Yeah.
might be some ethical dilemmas there. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I absolutely. I've been involved in developing, well, certainly advising on the development of behavioral analytic models. I think the first thing to say about behavioral analytic models, which would be the way that we talk about the sort of like the Minority Report type scenario, is they're actually really quite hard to get right and to get them to perform in any meaningful way, because what behavior would signal the potential for violent behavior about to occur, where the ability to predict that gives you time to actually do something about it.
Yeah.
So because the way that you construct a behavioral analytic model and the data that you use is often you have to try and analyze it within the context within which that data was actually generated in the first place. So if I give you an example, let's say that we create a behavioral analytic model that is saying there's certain factors that the behavioral analytic model looks for, such as sentiment analysis of a particular Reddit channel, and it's saying, oh, there seems to be some pretty vociferous, harmful type of language that historically is different from what the channel has previously. The sentiment has been quite a bit irritated, a bit frustrated, but now it's suddenly gone quite angry and violent. That might be a flag that goes up. But actually, unless you then go and examine that data, the actual data that was used that triggered that particular variable, you may find that it's just someone who's had a bad day and they're just venting. Because we live in a very complex, dynamic, random world ourselves as humans, and we express ourselves in ways slightly differently online than we would in person. And in some ways, our written language is when it's taken in isolation, you miss all sorts of important cues like the tone of voice, visual cues in terms of people's facial expression, so on and so forth. So that's one of the major limitations of behavioral analytic models, is that you're using data that it's very difficult to look at the broader context. so that you know the difference between someone having a bad day and someone actually going out and deciding they're going to drive their car into a crowd of people down the shopping mall.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so we're the reason I'm saying that is that I personally feel that we're quite a long way away from the sort of like the Minority Report scenario. But even if we were closer to that and we were able to encode complex human behavior sufficiently into a predictive model that we trust the output of that predictive model, the point at which we then turn that into action in the real world, such as kicking down doors and arresting people, that won't be an automated decision that just tasks the local police force to get in their cars and just go and kick down the door. It just doesn't work like that. Law doesn't allow us to work like that. So again, you still got the human in the loop who would be making sense of that prediction, saying, this behavioral analytic model we've had running on these forums or looking at Twitter or whatever has said that the change in threat state has increased. There's now an increased risk of threat from that particular community that we've been monitoring. Again, the human understands the broader context of that. They can go and look at the original data and they can read it and go, I think they're just having a bad day. And the important thing here, and I do labor this point, but we have to rely back on accountability. Who is accountable if the wrong decision is made and the wrong person is arrested and they subsequently lose their job because it's in the papers and so on and so forth? There's this cascade of harm that comes out of these decisions. That's why they're high stakes decisions. So that point about liability and accountability isn't going to go away. We're not suddenly going to find a way to allow AI to be accountable for its own actions and to be liable for its own actions, because we just don't have the legal instruments to do that. Why would we want to do that anyway?
yeah, yeah. Well, and I wanted to kind of segue into military applications because to me, this raises the stakes a bit. But AI offers significant potential to save lives and win wars. But it seems like the pace of conflict will push humans out of the loop. And it seems like that'll happen more rapidly than it would happen in something like business, right? Where the slower pace and perhaps less life and death nature of the circumstances are going to keep people around monitoring it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. It's definitely, I think there's greater risks in this space with this scenario that you're talking about here. And again, going back to Eric Schmidt's, when he was chair of the national AI panel that developed the US's national AI strategy, one of the things that clearly was raised as a concern there, and the US DoD actually last year reinforced this, is this genuine fear that if some of the West's major adversaries are willing to use fully autonomous capabilities, some of them lethal autonomous capabilities, such as, let's say, a drone of swarms that are all weaponized in some way. So hundreds and hundreds of drones unleashed at the same time on a single target. Clearly, it's impossible for a platoon of soldiers to take out such a threat. So how do you meet those threats in the most ethical way, where you're minimizing the risk of collateral damage? Military has had to deal with this conundrum for centuries.
Yeah.
And I think the most interesting thing here is not necessarily the technology and whether it's feasible. It is feasible. If we look at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, that's teaching us all an awful lot, more than we would like to know, about what modern warfare looks like versus, dare I say, Russia's more sort of traditional approach to warfare. So there's something quite interesting about the Ukraine situation that we need to learn from, to help guide our understanding of possible futures conflict scenarios where AI and autonomy is going to play a much more significant role. So let's get it right now. Let's think about those things up front now, so we can put in place the right treaties, the right policies to try and mitigate the risk of that. But here's the most interesting, I think, the most interesting conundrum for all of us here. In the UK, because this is one of the things that I've been talking about. In the UK, there's already been a ruling that we would never use lethal autonomous weapon systems. That was announced by the Ministry of Defence. It was part of the Defence AI strategy that they published last year. Now, that is the right statement to make, but it's untested. And what I mean by it's untested is that if we go up against an adversary that doesn't have the same relative ethical standards and they are completely willing to use lethal autonomous weapon systems, that's really going to test our resolve to hold that line about whether or not we'd ever use lethal autonomous weapon systems. We hope it never comes to that. But what we do have in the future, this is a political problem, not a technology or an engineering problem. It's how can we be proactive and how can governments come to some sort of a treaty around the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems to try and mitigate their use in the first place. And there's something there that's not too dissimilar to the way that nuclear technology is regulated around the world.
Ah,
But what we don't want is to have the situation where nuclear technology holds vast potential to help our world in a really, really positive way. But because it's such a significant threat to security, it's effectively so regulated, it's unusable beyond military purposes on the whole. We don't want AI to go down that route.
yeah.
There's a significant risk of that.
Well, so in broad general terms, Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, many others have talked about this technological singularity, where self-training AI bootstraps itself beyond the human capacity to control it. And I think in their case, the singularity is really AGI, right? And so a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
specialized systems will never get there. They're not capable of getting there. But in the case of the technological singularity, something that could, to some degree, mimic a human being, uh, basically upgrades itself beyond all human beings. Do you see a path from today's technologies to the kind of autonomous self-training AGI systems that could lead to the singularity, or is that currently kind of a bridge too far?
So I'm a technology optimist. So I do think that we will get close to. I tend to try and think about it more as a general purpose AI rather than an artificial general intelligence. So I think technically, I'm convinced that we'll get to something that we would look at it and go, that's AGI. I think that's a different question from whether the singularity will ever happen. And the reason I say that is because if we, as you mentioned, Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, and others, and Bill Gates, talking about the technological singularity, Ray Kurzweil as well, Nick Bostrom, there's plenty of people who've been talking about this risk and this potential future state. But the interesting thing is that they've focused on that end state. What they haven't, or what at least what I've not seen or heard, is them talking about and recognizing the significant uncertainty and therefore the significant complexity of the pathways that we may actually go on to get close to something like that. And what I mean by that is that we're not developing AI purely to develop an AGI that's going to bring the singularity on. We're not doing that. We're using AI to help us already, whether that's to make profit in a business or whether that's to actually help us have more fun in life, take more of the dross off us so that we can enjoy ourselves more. I'm more, rather than a super intelligence, rather than machine super intelligence, I'm more worried about human super intelligence. Because
Mm,
if we have significantly powerful AI that begins to get even close to an AGI, but its sole purpose is to maximize the cognitive performance of a person, then we will find it extremely difficult. We do find it extremely difficult to predict people's behavior. And I often talk about the way I talk about the human machine relationship is I say machines are really good at doing things right and doing them repeatably and doing them at a scale and a speed that is unmatched by humans. Humans are actually pretty good at deciding what the right thing is to do. And when I talk about that, what I mean is that we can look at something and go, that's not the right thing to do. That's unethical. Why would you do that? You're just going to hurt. We can empathize with situations, even non-human objects, whether there's animals or even a brick wall. How many times has an English person bumped into a door frame and apologized to the door frame. Happens all the time, right? So we have empathy. We have mirror neurons as part of our brain architecture that allow us to empathize. Unless we get to that point with machines where we think they can generally empathize, and there's a question whether or not an AGI needs to be able to empathize. I've always taken the view that there's a complementarity to machine and human intelligence, and let humans decide what's ethical. Let machines help us actually do that in a better way, in a wiser way. And so, but if in the wrong hands, someone who doesn't abide by ethical rules, someone who has neurological disease, or someone who is willing to commit harm with this incredible power at their fingertips, with AI, they're basically making them almost be like a demigod, putting someone in God mode. That terrifies me more than the idea of machine superintelligence. I'm more terrified by human superintelligence. But we
Yeah.
don't talk about that. We don't talk about the risks of humans using super powerful AI. We always only ever talk about this more. I think an unlikely scenario is that machines are going to basically do us out of business. I think the risks of and the likelihood of the pathway we're going to go on is going to take us much more towards human superintelligence.
Ah, well, and I appreciate your saying that. There seems to be a spectrum of thought about this. And, I actually did an interview quite a while ago with Dennis Bushnell, and he was talking about, he had said to me at one point, our children are already exploring Mars. And he was talking about the robots that are there, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
there's a sizable group of thinkers, of scientists, and innovators who view AI as our children, right? And like any child, I think how it turns out depends a lot on how you raise it. So, well, Richard,
Fascinating.
yeah, let me
Yeah.
let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir. I genuinely, it's wonderful to have you here. I sincerely appreciate it. Let me close by asking what comes next for you and what do you see happening in the near term with AI, right? I mean, Chat GPT is making headlines all over the world. Google Lambda made headlines last year.
Mhm.
Do you see anything along those lines happening in the near future? And how will you be engaged with this?
Well, let's talk about the near term. I think the most for me. I think the main thing we're going to hear about more of is massive foundation models. We're going to hear more about these trillion plus parameter neural networks, and what's called multimodal AI capabilities as well. And aligned to that is, and DeepMind published a paper about one of their capabilities called GATO, GATO, which is just more of sort of a general purpose capability that's able to do different things rather than just a singular thing. And I think that those two things are going to go almost hand in hand. I'm hoping we hear more about general purpose AI and the role of foundation models in enabling that. That's what I think we're going to hear more about. What I hope we hear more about is techniques that are not so reliant on massive amounts of data. So really getting into causal AI and really focusing on how can we develop AI capabilities that are potentially as performant at image recognition as convolutional neural networks, but actually you only have to train them on a small sample of images because conceptually the AI understands the image of a cat from a conceptual point of view
Mm.
rather than just simply the distribution, the statistical distribution of numbers that constitute the image. I'd love to see something. I'd love to see more of a breakthrough on the scale of sort of Chat GPT in that sort of realm in the next couple of years. That would be great. And I think we really need that as well. We really need that. In terms of me, what I'm doing next, well, I've co-founded an AI startup company called Tulpa, TULPA, and what we're doing is pretty much what I've talked about in the book, which is how can we use AI to help people make better decisions? How can we use AI to understand how someone completes a task understand where they get frustrated at completing that task, or what's stopping them from completing that task in a performant way, and what interventions can the AI make into that person's workflow to actually help them do that task better. And so that's one of the things we're working on at the moment. Really excited about that because we've already spotted some really interesting applications in cyber defense, where we think that really what we're aiming to do is trying to help people who are having to try and make sense of very complex, very dynamic, very fast changing scenarios and situations. How can we use AI to actually extend in time the point at which they might start to hit that sort of information overload or that cognitive overload, where they start to make less good decisions? What we're trying to do with Tulpa is actually push that out in time, so that they can act at a high level of performance for longer.
Wonderful. Well, Richard, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Tim.